praying. Let's talk about this opinion piece. America's quiet default. Seizing Russian holdings of American debt risks the role of the U.S. in international system and opens the door for gold and Bitcoin. So this is an opinion piece from CoinDesk. It should be approached as such. I will have opinions on it as well. Amid the dying embers of World War II in an ornate ballroom in New Hampshire, in a New Hampshire resort in July 1944, America gathered the imminent victors of the war and designed a new monetary system. Global currencies would be various weights of the dollar, redeemable for gold held with the U.S. Pretty hilarious. At the time, a British economist spoke up and suggested instead a neutral international settlement medium consisting of a basket of sovereign currencies. This Bancor idea, proposed by a certain John Maynard Keynes, there we go, was overruled by American delegation, which favored the more U.S.-centric dollar-gold standard. From 1944 to 1971, sovereign currencies were simply different weights of the dollar, redeemable by the governments themselves for actual gold at a rate of $35 an ounce. The tether was tenuous, however. The entire system depended on the beneficence of the U.S. government. Of the U.S. government and its willingness to not overspend, increasing the ratio of dollars to underlying gold. Things came to a head when the U.S. spent extravagantly on President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society and the Vietnam War, and sovereigns began to doubt the veracity of America's promise to redeem currency for gold on demand. In August of 1971, France called America's bluff and dispatched a battleship to retrieve their gold. President Richard Nixon knew the U.S. could not honor its commitments and defaulted on the promise that it held since 1944. The U.S. would no longer honor the peg. A decade of ruinous inflation followed, and the U.S. was only able to stabilize the dollar through enormous rate hikes. In combination with the inventive petrodollar scheme, this latter device saw the U.S. ally with oil producers like the Saudis, guaranteeing them military production in exchange for the exclusive pricing of oil in dollars. Combined with the recycling of profits into U.S. treasuries, with a reliable treasury bid secured, faith in the dollar that was lost in Nixon's default was restored. Now, I wanted to point out something here that actually happened recently. I believe it was Venezuela and their petro. Venezuela petro. And it was one of the first cryptocurrencies to be banned, actually, in the United States. And it's important to understand why it was banned, especially in context to this article. What Venezuela's petro is essentially a digital currency, a cryptocurrency that was pegged to the price of a barrel of oil within Venezuela. Now, it didn't mean that oil was already produced. What it was pegged to was the presumed amount of oil in the ground in Venezuela. So it's a little tricky as far as that goes, but it's important to note that really, really, really quickly, the U.S. banned that petro, and you're not allowed technically as a U.S. citizen to participate in it. Why would that be? Well, the U.S. dollar, like we're seeing, is really pegged to oil, and that would be essentially a threat to the U.S. dollar if you had basically a cryptocurrency that's pegged to the price of oil, right? So what's interesting that should also be noted is things like Pax Gold, which are basically cryptocurrencies that are tied to the price of gold, are not banned in the U.S. So it is definitely more of a threat to the U.S. to have something pegged to oil than to gold. At least that's what we can kind of extrapolate from the way the government reacts and how quickly they react to these different cryptocurrency ideas and what they're tied to. Other tools facilitated the re-entrenchment of the dollar in overseas commerce. The U.S. funneled its cheap debt into military spending and became the de facto guarantor of the markets globally, ensuring energy and food security for the globe by protecting trade routes with its blue water navy. The U.S. set the rules of the game through their control of the international financial institutions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, for short-term lending to sovereigns, and the World Bank for long-term development finance. The U.S. maintained an open capital account and allowed their securities market to become a global piggy bank for savers worldwide. Today, the size of publicly traded securities in the U.S. relative to public markets worldwide vastly outweighs its share of global gross domestic product, GDP. U.S. dollars denominate most international trade, even for exchanges occurring outside the U.S., outside the country. U.S. Treasuries came to be considered the global risk-free savings device for sovereigns, as the U.S. was presumed to have no default risk whatsoever. The Federal Reserve became the lender of last resort for central banks, willing to create unlimited liquidity to support markets worldwide during times of stress. Even absent the tether to gold, the U.S. dollar thrived as the dominant medium of settlement internationally, and U.S. Treasuries served as the default savings device globally. Around 2014, however, something began to turn. Foreign government purchases of U.S. debt began to stagnate. Even though foreign purchases of treasuries eventually picked up in absolute terms in 2018, they didn't remotely keep up with the expanding scale of the U.S. debt. In short, foreigners who had long supported America's largesse, well, I don't know that word actually, I have to Google that. Some of these I can read, not pronounce, but read and know the definition. Some of these I don't know either. A gift or money given. Okay. Cool. We got it. Learning together. By eagerly buying its debt. We're buying less and less of our new debt issuance. Foreign ownership of U.S. debt declined from 34% in 2015 to 24% at the end of 2021. China's ownership declined from $1.25 trillion in 2015 to under $1.1 trillion in 2021. To compensate for this diminishing outside interest, the U.S. looked inward for new creditors. The Federal Reserve held around 4% of U.S. debt in 2009. That figure climbed to 19% today. These purchases made with dollars summoned out of thin air come with a giant asterisk. They do not derive from organic demand for our debt. They are only sustainable as long as inflation is tolerably low, which it no longer is. In February, it hit a 40-year high of 7.5%. The exact explanation for the lost appetite among foreigners for U.S. dollars and U.S. debt is hard to pin down. It may have been a delayed reaction from the 2008 crisis, when the Fed made it clear that the ability to print unlimited dollars to support domestic markets at the expense of foreigners. It might have been the aggressive sanctions the U.S. instituted against Russian banks after Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. The most economically powerful nation the U.S. had ever targeted in such a manner. Previously, sanctions had been reserved for small, economically unimportant nations. At the time, the U.S. threatened to exclude Russia from the SWIFT international transfer system entirely, but backed down due to the severity of the measure. Russia took the threat to heart, and its central bank divested most of its U.S. Treasury exposure and set up a SWIFT alternative called SPFS. Even as the Russians took steps to free themselves from the dependence on the dollar system, the U.S. wisely walked back from the brink, realizing that American and European banks were hopelessly intertwined with Russian ones. At the time, President Obama laid out a prescient warning regarding the risk to the dollar system that arbitrary exclusions could pose. In 2015, he cautioned in the context of unilateral Iran sanctions. Joe Biden did not heed the warning of his former boss. First, the U.S. seized Afghan central bank assets held in New York and bizarrely handed a large portion over to the plaintiffs in a 9/11 lawsuit. While the seizure may have been predictable, expropriating the savings of ordinary Afghans and distributing them to Americans affected by 9/11, an attack perpetuated by Saudis, is deeply unusual. Partly as a consequence, the Afghan banking system is kneeling over, worsening a humanitarian crisis. Not content with that, Biden then dropped a financial nuke on Russia with the seizure of her reserves. It's important to untangle the perceived immorality of this action, a reaction to an unjust invasion, and its prudence. While seizing Afghan or Russian reserves may feel righteous and just, the immediate effect of such actions is to completely undermine the credibility of dollar debt as an international savings device. The U.S. wants to have its cake and eat it too. We need foreigners to buy our debt so the government can finance its structurally high levels of spending. But we increasingly seek to impose moral conditions on who can hold that debt. The U.S. will find that their creditors are increasingly unwilling to pass these purity tests and will choose to hold a money that doesn't require the owner to comport with Washington's latest political fashions. I mean, look, you guys know where I stand on the way we have to approach cryptocurrency globally and how I feel about specifically cryptocurrency itself being restricted from certain geographical locations. And the thing is it all does kind of tie into this in general. And when you kind of start putting like two and two together, you kind of see where the problem is, right? Which is essentially the US dollar and this like conflated like money game that we play with the whole entire world. And it is true, like you can either do that or you can go ahead and stand the moral ground. If you try to do both, you know, these countries are going to lose faith in the US dollar as a savings, because if we're just going to continue to utilize that as a way to strong arm people into doing what we want them to do on the global stage, it just doesn't work that well, right? It's very interesting. Author Luke Groman pulled no punches, asserting that the Fed and the European Central Bank, ECB, quote, completely discredited sovereign debt as an FX reserve, completely, end quote, adding that the, quote, the multi-currency, multipolar world was likely fully born on Wednesday night, end quote. Fed blogger Joseph Wang called the freezes of FX reserves, quote, financial WMDs, end quote. Ooh, that's a strong term. I think that's going maybe a little far. Adding that, quote, foreign sovereigns must now diversify as a matter of national security, and some citizens must now diversify as a matter of self-preservation, end quote. And what I would encourage, of course, is the citizens diversifying as a matter of self-preservation. Because what we're here to fight for is the individual and the individual's financial autonomy. I understand that national security for a lot of these countries and blah, 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 they're going to find other assets out of the US dollar. For you as an individual, for us as an individual, what we're looking for, of course, is that financial autonomy on a peer-to-peer basis. And so I definitely agree with that second portion, which is to diversify as a matter of self-preservation. And that doesn't matter if you live in the US, the UK, China, Russia, whatever. You should also have access to that no matter where you're at. Wang points out that India and China, both of whom voted abstain on the United Nations motion to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, maintain heavily FX-based sovereign reserves that they will now be eyeing uneasily. Russia made the fundamental miscalculation of not realizing all of their foreign fiat reserves were at risk. Other nation states falling afoul of the U.S. will not repeat that mistake. Most notably, the celebrated Credit Suisse, Swiss interest rate. Strategist Zoltan Pozsar declared an end to the Bretton Woods II, the post-1971 pure fiat period based on the petrodollar and treasury recycling. Bretton Woods II was built on inside money, and its foundations crumbled a week ago when the G7 seized Russia's FX reserves, he wrote. While the reach of gold bugs and Fed critics might extend only to narrow echo chambers on Twitter, fair point, Pozsar's words reverberate around the financial community. For once, the difference between gold and dollars is starkly clear. Outside of James Bond novels, gold cannot be immobilized at a distance. Dollars and dollar assets can. While not as dramatic as the Nixon shock, the Biden sanction was just as genuine a default. That's one thing, because I talked to my dad, because I'm not actually, like, I wasn't around for, like, that period of time when essentially there's huge lines. The unemployment was, like, really high. Inflation was really high. Everything was rough. And from the perspective of people that lived through that, just to give you an idea, they see that coming now again. So whatever that sphere looked like, if you talk to people that lived through it, they definitely feel that that is what's going to happen now. So I want to make sure that, like, you guys understand that, like, we are probably going to go through some tough economic times here. And even though we're saying it's not as bad, it's too early to really tell, right? Things really didn't get that bad right at that time. It took some time to build up. So just stay prepared and stay frosty and keep aware of what's going on, because there are, correlations. History does repeat itself, and this is definitely a risk, as we can tell. Anyways, rug pulling the Russians, even if warranted, introduced for the first time genuine doubt into the quality of the commitment the U.S. can maintain towards foreign creditors. The prospect of total asset invalidation is an unacceptable tail risk, and any nation state worry of falling foul of U.S. sensibilities, especially as the U.S. becomes ever more capricious and less interested in the well-being of the international sphere it used to govern, will consider diversifying out of the U.S. treasuries and other freezable assets. In 2022, Pozsar's outside money is king. For now, that's gold. But even the former skeptic has some time for its digital analog, concluding, quote, Bitcoin, if it still exists after the war, end quote, will probably benefit from all of this. Do you think Bitcoin will still exist after the war? I think yes. Especially, like, have you guys seen, like, people sending transactions and mining, etc. via ham radios? That's dope. I think that we are definitely going to see Bitcoin exist post this war that's going on, even if it expands larger. The threat, of course, to Bitcoin would be full-on blackouts. We're talking EMPs, that sort of stuff. Is that possible? Sure. What else would be possible if we went way down the rabbit hole and went as extreme as possible? Nuclear. But at that point, humanity doesn't exist, so the existence of Bitcoin is therefore null and void and doesn't really matter. I hope you enjoyed this clip from the Crypto Mining Morning Show every Monday through Friday, 7:45 a.m. Pacific and 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time. You can check out more clips here, or if you're interested in checking out the entire live show, you can check that out down here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Tuesday.